Ambassador Suleymanov has been the ambassador of Azerbaijan to the United States since October of 2011. He is not, new to this area, because before that, for 5 years, he was the Consul General of Azerbaijan to Los Angeles, and led a team which actually established Azerbaijani diplomatic presence on the West Coast. Prior to that, Ambassador Suleymanov was the consular at the Foreign Relations Department and Office of the President in Baku, and a press officer of the Azerbaijani embassy in Washington. He's joined his diplomatic service for a long time, and working with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Azerbaijan. He is a graduate of Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in Medford, Massachusetts. At the same time, Mr. Suleymanov also holds graduate degrees from the Political Geography Department of the Moscow State University in Russia, and from the University of Toledo in Ohio. Mr. Suleymanov has authored numerous articles and is a frequent presenter at academic events, including this one. Please join me welcoming Ambassador Suleymanov.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you to the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy and the Johns Hopkins University for holding this event. I think it's timely, interesting, and somewhat confusing, which I think that is the story of our lives and the story of the subject we're discussing. As I was walking in, I caught a bit of Professor Leahy's presentation, which I think was very interesting, and as a discussion, especially on the equation between soft and hard power in application to foreign policy and in diplomacy. And I think that is the equation of which every political leadership and every diplomat, I think, as a matter of fact, thinks all the time. How do you balance them off? Indeed, at a time when today we're facing a growing degree of radical views, and in fact, be it religious views or ethnic views, they often tend to go to an extreme. I mean, I would almost disagree with you, sir, that yes, extremism, sometimes you need to take your beliefs and views to an extreme to be heard. However, if you live in a community, if you live on an island, that's fine, because then the louder you scream, the more people hear or don't hear. But if you live in a community, the greater is the volume of the conversation, the more damage it causes at the end of the day, because it forces other people to go. For instance, I'll give you one example, is in our part of the world, and you know where Azerbaijan is located, it's in the Caucasus. It's the largest of the 3 Caucasus nations, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. If you look at our part of the world, one of our neighbors, Russian Federation, has nuclear weapons. It's a nuclear power. It has always, from the very beginning of the nuclear age, it had nuclear weapons. There is some discussion and suspicion that our other neighbor, significant neighbor, the Islamic Republic of Iran, wants to acquire nuclear weapons. Now, without going into the merits of whether that's a justified desire, whether they want to do it, or whether it's a suspicion, it's a different issue. But the merit and the value of non-proliferation regime is very obvious, because the moment they acquire that, everybody else would have to acquire. They might have a legitimate perception that this is something they need, and they want to take it to an extreme. But once you do that, you raise up the volume for everybody, and then it becomes a little bit dangerous. So what do you do? How do you deal with the situations when you want to get your views across, but yet you do it without causing damage to either yourself or surrounding areas. I mean, in fact, self-preservation instinct is important here because you can't really cause damage to others without causing it to yourself. I think that's a lesson which larger countries or greater powers don't always understand. We always see a bigger and a greater power vis-à-vis a smaller power as the smaller power only being the one who gets the damage, the only damage receiver. But it goes both ways. I will not comment on more recent situations here, but the war in Vietnam was very indicative. It just takes you to walk to the Vietnam Memorial to see that Vietnam was not the only society severely damaged by what happened. Then in my former Union, the Soviet Union where I used to live and grew up, the Soviet leaders thought that invasion of Afghanistan would be only damaging to Afghanistan, and basically they didn't even think it would be that damaging. But the result of it was obvious that the Soviet Union collapsed. The damage caused to the people of the Soviet Union was so enormous, which at the end of the day, as a calculation, perhaps was not worth it. At the end of the day, it's, I mean, whatever benefit there was, if there was any, would by far outweigh by the damage of, from the point of view of the Soviet leadership by dissolution of the Soviet Union. So you have to think about those equations as well. So how do you do that? What do you do in this case? I will speak a little bit of the experience of my country. Azerbaijan as a society exists on a crossroads of many, many cultures and many, many fault lines. You could call them fault lines, connecting lines, depends. Well, first of all, Azerbaijan is the only country in the world, the only country, which borders both Russia and Iran. Now think about that. Azerbaijan is 9.3 million people, 9.5 million people. We border Iran, which is almost 10 times bigger than us, and for centuries had aspirations of, and in fact, throughout history, for centuries controlled the territory of the Caucasus. Then you have, of course, to the north of us, the largest nation on earth, the Russian Federation, which had controlled the Caucasus up until very recently, up until 2 decades ago. You have these two large powers and centers of cultural influence, and not only cultural influence, sometimes they don't hesitate to use hard power. And that is something which affects, of course, the identity in Azerbaijan as well. It's not only in Azerbaijan, throughout the whole former Soviet Union, but in Azerbaijan, the mix of the presence of both Iran and Russia has adds a certain dynamic which doesn't exist in other places. Then, of course, you have, that also brings several things. Azerbaijani predominantly Muslim population has a predominantly Shia presence, but also a Sunni presence. So Azerbaijan is a fault line between Sunni and Shia presence. You could see that very obviously. Azerbaijan is a fault line between Slavic and Turkic people, because that is where the line comes in. Azerbaijan is also a fault line and a mix between Turkic and Persian civilizations. And it's also the place where Asia meets Europe. It's also the place where Middle East meets extreme East, Southeastern Europe. All that together produced a very interesting effect, which brings me to the earlier mentioning of being careful with the volume of the conversation. If you live in a neighborhood like that, you have to be very careful. By definition, you look around and say, how do we make sure that everybody is comfortable enough to live in a normal neighborhood? How do you build a country, how do you build a society where it is inclusive enough and diverse enough to be stable enough? That is something which is not easy. I mean, if you look at the examples of today's, of modern conversations, globally, that's not where the usual discussions go. Well, Azerbaijan has, from the very beginning of its tradition, from its very beginning of the existence, I mean, if you look back, in 1918, Azerbaijan established the first republic with its predominantly Muslim population in 1918, which did something that was then unique. By 1919, the Republic of Azerbaijan granted all its citizens, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, and gender, the right to vote equally in the elections. Now, when I say gender, it's an interesting point because that was ahead of the United States of America. Many people don't realize that. And I always make this caveat because I was caught when I said that in the state of Wyoming, it was after, yes, it was after the state of Wyoming, but it was ahead of the rest of the United States of America. So that shows the aspiration of the people of Azerbaijan, what we wanted to build, a space where people come together and try to build a successful nation, regardless of their ethnic backgrounds. That aspiration exists today as well, in a very strong form. I would just name a couple of examples. Azerbaijani government has hosted a number of events which focused on intercultural dialogue and interreligious discussions. One of them was the first ever global forum on intercultural dialogue held in Baku in 2011, I apologize. 2011, which was hosted by the president of Azerbaijan and brought together about 500 leaders from around the world to discuss how they can develop common values through cultural diversity. It was co-organized by Council of Europe, UNESCO, UN Alliance for Civilizations, I believe also by ISESCO, which is the Islamic equivalent of UNESCO. We actually are planning a second forum in June, which I think shows not only the aspiration but a sustained commitment to that matter. Also, I'll just bring one other example. If you look at the Caucasus, for instance, if you take out Turkey and Iran, which both are predominantly Muslim nations, Russia, Georgia, and Armenia are Christian nations. They are our neighbors, but they're Christian. Azerbaijan is a Muslim nation. Yet, when the Pope of Rome, John Paul II, the late Pope of Rome, wanted to visit the Caucasus, the only place he visited was the capital of Azerbaijan, Baku. He didn't go to other places. He didn't go to Christian Armenia, not to Christian Georgia, not to Christian Russia. He went to Azerbaijan. That might have been his personal preference. I also like to go to Rome. And Baku is a good place. I don't want to sound too selfish in this case. In that region, I would also visit Baku. It's a good-looking city. But I think he had other ideas as well. But that speaks for what Azerbaijan stands for. The openness of Azerbaijani society is widely recognized. A number of leaders speak about that. It's a widely accepted notion. But we can't stop there. We need to think how to move forward. And it goes back to soft versus hard power. Azerbaijani troops were part of the coalition in Iraq. Obviously an application of hard power. Yet when they talked to people around the Haditha Dam, they did not talk as invaders. Nor did they talk as somebody who came there to occupy that country or to speak to those people as enemies. Therefore, when, as a part of the agreement, Azerbaijani forces were leaving Iraq, it was the ambassador of Iraq in Azerbaijan who came to our leadership and asked us to stay longer. Well, we didn't stay longer because the particular agreements, they don't provide for that. But that's an example of how it works. Today, Azerbaijan is serving in Afghanistan. But the biggest thing we could do for Afghanistan is not to serve there as military force, but to help Afghanistan to build a secular society which would be based on common values and be integrated with the region. That's why Azerbaijan today trains its civilian forces, police, and others. When we look back, I'll just bring a couple of examples to speak on specific subject of cultural diplomacy, and I know I have very little time left. One of them is, how do you use culture as an element of diplomacy? I spoke yesterday at an event, and I mentioned that the first ever opera in the Muslim world was written and staged in Azerbaijan. It was 1908. It was called Leyli ve Mecnun. Now, Leyli ve Mecnun was written by Nizami Ganjavi, the 12th century Azerbaijani poet. It was also then later recycled several times by different other poets throughout the history. Leyli ve Mecnun is a very, very widespread story. There was still discussion whether it was Shakespeare who was inspired by Nizami, or whether it was Nizami who predicted what Shakespeare would write. I don't know. But the story of a man loving a woman and her parents were being hesitant to let them live together. Apparently, is a widespread subject of discussion, which basically is a good example, headway for our diplomacy discussion, because what it does, it helps us that people share the same perceptions. Okay, the story is kind of tragic at the end of the day, but it's a common tragedy for people in Italy, in Verona, and the people in Ganja, and people throughout the Orient. So we have so much in common. One of my favorite examples of cultural diplomacy is that there is a project called Salam Ola, which is promoted by the Azerbaijani musicians, in which they, together with Andean musicians, mostly Ecuadorians and Bolivians, sing together. And they don't, it's not that Bolivians sing Azerbaijani music or Azeris sing Bolivian music. Each of them plays their own music. Yet together, it produces a fantastic effect of commonality. I didn't know we had so much in common. Once you listen to that, you understand. I think that's why what the Heydar Aliyev Foundation does in Azerbaijan, led by the First Lady, and what they do is actually very interesting. They very much focused, thank you very much, on promoting Mugham, the very ancient Azerbaijani tradition. Mugham by itself, I think whoever listens to Mugham understands Azerbaijan much better than they would listening to me. And I think that speaks for itself. Two other things I would, and I know it's about to go. If you want to understand the region, whatever I tell you, or whatever any of my colleagues would tell you, would be much less valuable than the book written by a mysterious writer, Kurban Said, called Alain Nino. That book is very much telling you what the cultural diplomacy is all about. For American cultural diplomacy, all you needed to do was to attend the Jennifer Lopez concert in Baku in September. I tell you honestly, I was sitting there and the hall was full. It was a very good performance. God bless Mrs. Lopez. She's a very, very good performer. She worked very hard. So first thing you notice, which comes across very well, that Americans have a very strong work ethic. She worked all the way. I mean, she worked very hard. The other thing you notice is how receptive the people are. And when about 40,000 people looked at her and her concert, she spoke. Everybody who left told me one thing. I was standing there, and there was one guy who never spoke English, never been abroad and all this. He comes up to me and says, "Did you see that woman?" I said, "Yeah, yeah. What do you think?" And he said to me, "I love America." I thought to myself, that's good. That's very cost benefit. In fact, we paid for the concert. So Americans wasted no money. And I said, I know a couple of places we need to send Mrs. Lopez. She will be very successful. Which brings me to the final point. When I came to America in 1992 to study in this country as a Muskie Fellow, it was the first year I was called Benjamin Franklin Fellow, then changed to Muskie. Everybody was confused because at that point nobody knew who Muskie was until I met the great man. I never met Benjamin Franklin. So, and what happened was that I didn't come to Washington, I didn't come to New York, I didn't come to Los Angeles. I went to a bellwether city of Toledo, Ohio, where everybody passes, every presidential candidate shows up for 10 minutes to know that whether he's going to lose or win the elections. And everybody passes through. Nobody stays in the holy Toledo, except me. I stayed for 2 years. The goodness of the people of America was amazing. Who you meet in Toledo, Ohio, you fall in love with America. There was no politics, no hiding things, straightforward, no locking doors, clear conversation about people, and very, very great openness. I think one of the greatest values which gets somewhat overshadowed by Hollywood, by the perception, by the media, by the internet, which I don't always agree is a positive thing. Because again, people who scream louder get the message across in it. The most valuable thing Americans can do is to show the goodness of American society to the rest of the world. In that case, and I go back to what Professor Leahy said, something like Peace Corps is an extremely valuable tool. Because what people need to know and to meet is to meet people who are real. Same way as it is true for Americans. What Americans need to also understand about the Muslim world, if that exists, and I don't like that term because I don't take the word Christian word, so I think equally the Muslim world is also as diverse as Christian. But if you go back and look at the perceptions and stereotypes and caricatures we have about Muslims, most Muslims don't wear turbans, don't walk in these long dresses, and don't ride camels. Although it's very healthy for you, by the way. They don't do that. And it's not a good thing that we don't do that, but we don't. Most Afghans don't run around with machine guns. Some of them do, but most of them don't. Most Pakistanis do not try to kill diplomats, and most Pakistanis are very educated people going about their work. The same way we need to look at the world as it is and don't fall victims to caricatures. Same way I think the world needs to look at the United States and don't fall for a caricature of, which is by the way produced often by American production itself, so Hollywood and American news. If, for instance, I talked to my friends recently and they canceled their visits to America. Very many of them cancel their visits because they say people get shot in public spaces. Yes, some people do get shot and it's very unfortunate, but such a focus on that creates a very different caricature because that's what people hear about America. Same way people here in the news hear about the majority of Muslims trying to engage in extremist or radical activities, which both are not true. Anyway, I think I spoke for way too long, and I think I went beyond 5 minutes you allotted me. I apologize for that. But if I would be good at time management, I would not be an Azerbaijani. So that's true too. So please, if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Değmez Hanım.
I liked very much your notion about that people in conversations in our region should be very careful. That was my question will go to the religious freedom in Azerbaijan. As you have mentioned several times in your presentation, the parallel, State Department of the United States issued a report on international freedom, as you may be aware of, and there it reports about restrictions of the freedom in Azerbaijan and actual deterioration of the situation in 2011 led to several new laws. I would like to ask you to dwell on this situation. Azerbaijan, what Azerbaijan does to provide those concerns, and do you find the discrepancy between what you have portrayed today and between that report? And if you allow me one just minor correction, John Paul II, Pope of Rome, visited Armenia in 2001. We have still the monument about on the honor of his visit. And what I remember from that visit, he also visited our countries in our region, including Syria, Lebanon, and our country. That's no correction. I don't know what were the criteria of his visit as well. Thank you.
Awesome. Oh, I don't. Thank you very much. I don't consider countries of Syria and Greece to be part of our region, but maybe. Okay, Mr. Vanessa, I appreciate the concern of my Armenian colleagues for the religious freedom in Azerbaijan. Thank you for your question. Indeed, Azerbaijan is very well known for its religious freedom, if you know, and tolerance. If you look at the situation in our neighbors, including Armenia, you would see that having a very homogeneous society, it's sometimes difficult to understand the difference between diversity and homogeneity. That's very much where the difference comes from, and that's where the misunderstandings come from. I disagree with the assessments of what you described. Generally speaking, religious freedom reports always emphasize the long-standing degree of religious freedom and openness in Azerbaijan, including the American ones. The number of laws which have been adopted in Azerbaijan have a reason to do that. They are aimed at dealing with radical groups. Of course, the United States itself, and we don't publish the reports about the US practices. We simply don't have time to that, and we don't think it's useful, and we don't think that's our business to get too much involved on an official level, though I would always be happy to share our advice with both our American friends and our Armenian neighbors on how to deal with those situations. But in case of religious extremist groups, of course, certain restrictions will be imposed simply for maintaining law and order. Yet, hundreds and hundreds of religious communities of all different denominations operate in Azerbaijan. They're extremely open, successful, and there's no questions there. I'm not aware of significant questions regarding this. There might be an issue over one particular group or the different particular group in particular time, frame, and registration, and some bureaucratic procedures that is related to migration services and stuff like that. That is normal. But on a significant levels, that doesn't exist. Now, when I also look at this, I also understand that in things like religious freedom and tolerance and all this, the formalities of reports, we live in our region, you know that. The formalities of reports do not always reflect the reality. If you go to a country, if you spend your time, if you talk to religious leaders and religious communities, you will see the difference for yourself. And so do our colleagues from the United States diplomatic services. If you talk to the embassy of Azerbaijan, I think they're the ones who praise Azerbaijani tolerance more than anybody else. Sometimes I actually tell them as well to lower the volume, not to go too far in this, because as much as I like the praise, the only thing I want to be loud in Azerbaijan is the music of Mrs. Lopez. That's all I do.
Next. Could you briefly present yourself, say your name and present yourself? Thank you. Kate Nahapetian with the Armenian National Committee of America. The Obama administration and Senator Kerry were, quote, appalled this summer when Azerbaijan pardoned, promoted, and granted an apartment to a convicted killer for axing a sleeping Armenian to death in Budapest during a NATO program. The killer has expressed no remorse for the murder and has said he wished he could have killed more Armenians. Why has Azerbaijan promoted this unrepentant killer in the military? And will Azerbaijan reincarcerate him per the agreement Azerbaijan had with Hungary, who agreed to transfer him to Azerbaijan because they believed he would serve his life sentence there?
Thank you, Mr. Representant. We have, just for information of everybody here, we have this conversation going on again and again and again. I probably cannot, I do it more frequently than I take my breakfast for the last 6 months. Thank you very much for being so persistent and so dedicated to my presence. Thank you. I appreciate your commitment to this. I think there are some factual inaccuracies in what you said. Mr. Safarov served his sentence for the acts he committed in Hungary. He was sentenced by the court in Hungary for his deeds. He did not just axe a sleeping Armenian. He had a confrontation with an Armenian officer, a military man, during a military exercise, training exercise in Hungary. What he did was wrong. He was convicted for that by the court. He served his 8 years, which was deemed sufficient by Hungarian authorities to be able to be extradited and transferred, as a matter of fact, to Azerbaijan. Azerbaijani law and international law provides for the right of pardon. The president was fully within his rights to pardon a man. Mr. Safarov was never glorified. He served his sentence. Whether his sentence was sufficiently strong or whether it was mild in terms of Hungarian law, that's a subject which neither you nor I can decide. Neither you nor I are judges in this case. There are many legal acts in the United States we disagree or agree with. There were convicted terrorists who came to Armenia, were released. There was a monument in Armenia, and there was a school named after Monte Melkonian, who was a convicted terrorist. But it's a different issue. Mr. Safarov was not glorified. He is not glorified. He is a person who served his sentence for what he did. He is also, very unfortunately, a person who suffered from the conflict and committed an act which he should not have committed. But that's a legal matter. Of course, because the decision was fully within the rights and in full accordance with international and Azerbaijani laws, he will not be reincarcerated simply because the decision is fully legal.
The last question is perhaps for me, back into the culture. I can see that Azerbaijan is following a soft power, in a cultural diplomacy, especially if we consider that your first forum in intercultural dialogue and interreligious dialogue, and also for the second one, I was involved with the Council of Europe on that, and very interesting, and your colleague and the Azerbaijani delegation is very powerful in that issues. Especially also they opened, Ms. Aliyev opened a House of Culture, in Paris, I think 2 months ago. I was there also, very, very nice one. I think you have to, if you are in Paris, just to pump in and just look at it.
They don't send me to Paris, you see, this is somebody's luckier than me. Yeah,
yeah, but perhaps. And what do you think? Is there any objectives they follow, or there's what is the next step? It's just a new, or because this policy of cultural diplomacy is just really started 2 or 3 years ago.
I think, thank you very much. I think the policy has been there for a long time. The ability and capacity to promote it appear this. I mean, it takes certain resources to open a cultural center. And indeed, in the one in Paris, there was one planned, I think, in Austria, and there is now a decision to open up in different places.
In Washington, perhaps?
I hope so. Well, if it's on the record, I want that to be recorded. Yes, that would be a good idea. But there's a trade and cultural center here in Georgetown as well. What I think, for a country like Azerbaijan, I think I will mention that the Azerbaijani culture is bigger than Azerbaijani politics. Presenting culture gets a greater resonance. I think we should do it more because Azerbaijani culture, A, is a very effective tool to present Azerbaijan to the world, definitely. But more importantly, it's also very inclusive. And I was, just as people listening to represent our American culture and cannot but connect to people. I think people outside Azerbaijan relate to Azerbaijan better if they hear culture. Also, going back to discussions of extremism and radicalism. Very often, you go to extremes to be heard. What do you want to do? You want to make an asymmetric impact of what you want to be heard, right? That's why you, unfortunately, often it refers to violence. But you could also do it to culture. If culture is something which gets an asymmetric message across in a loud enough volume, why not to use that? If Azerbaijan succeeds in doing that, that could be a good example of what could be done for the others. Because, I mean, many people talk about Algeria and Tunisia. Not that many people talk about Algeria and Tunisia, as they should perhaps. It's a very good cultural spaces. But if you listen to but so many people, without even knowing that, listen to Algerian and Tunisian singers. They're good, very good, by the way. I personally, I've never been to Mali. Never, unfortunately. But I like the Malian singers. The impact the culture gets across gets a resonance much higher than a violent act trying to reproduce the echo chamber. So I think if we succeed in doing that as a deliberate policy, at some point that could become a useful tool for policymakers as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we express our gratitude to the ambassador?
Thank you.